The morning of January 12th, 1888 broke warm enough to fool even the careful. By 8 o'clock, the thermometer outside Hale's general store read 9 degrees Celsius, the kind of reading that made a Nebraska winter feel like a debt temporarily forgiven. Children who had been cooped inside through 3 weeks of gray cold ran out into the street without their coats. Farmers who had delayed checking their fence lines since December finally pulled on their boots with something resembling hope. Miss Theodora Vance threw open the schoolhouse windows for the first time since October, letting air that almost smelled like thaw move through rooms that had grown stale with the breath of 28 children. No one looked northwest. There was no reason to. The sky in that direction was the same pale blue as everywhere else, and the light on the snow made the whole flat world around Harlan Flats, Nebraska territory look almost forgiving. Maren Solvik had been awake since 5. She stood at the door of the structure the town called the Barrow, a mug of coffee going cold in her left hand, her right hand flat against the doorframe. 40 years old, with shoulders that belonged on a woman who had spent a decade moving earth, she had the stillness of someone long past the need to fill silence with motion. Her hair, the color of old wheat, was already braided and pinned. Her eyes, a gray that people tended to remember without knowing why, were fixed on the northwestern horizon. There was a line there, thin, darker than the sky around it by precisely the wrong amount. Not a cloud. Clouds moved with the wind. This thing moved against it, or rather it moved as if the wind itself was its servant pushed ahead of it like water in front of a barge. She watched it for 30 seconds. Then she stepped back inside. "Ruth!" Her voice carried to the back of the main hall where her sister was banking the morning fire. "Light both stoves. Pull everything from the root cellar. All of it. Stack the extra blankets at the stable entrance." Ruth Solvik appeared from around the stone fireplace, 28 years old, red-haired with the kind of face that showed everything her sisters showed nothing. "The thermometer outside says it's practically spring." "The thermometer outside is going to be wrong very soon. Do it now." Ruth looked at her for a moment, measuring something in the set of Maren's jaw, then turned without another word. This was one of the things that made Ruth essential. She had learned years ago that when Maren's voice dropped that flat, the discussion was already over. Maren set down her coffee, pulled on her heaviest coat, and went to find her horse. She had arrived in Harlan Flats 6 years earlier with $23, a 7-year-old daughter named Astrid, a sister, a single-blade felling axe, and a sheet of newspaper covered in sketches she had memorized so completely she no longer needed to look at it. The town had not made her arrival easy. Nothing about that spring of 1882 had been easy, which was, she had come to understand, entirely the point. Her husband Eric had died in 1879 in a mining tunnel outside Carbondale, Illinois, in a collapse that killed 11 men on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The tunnel had been flagged as unstable 6 weeks before by a foreman whose report the company owners filed away in a drawer. Maren had found this out during the lawsuit. She had also found out that finding it out made no legal difference whatsoever, that grief was not a form of currency. The courts recognized that the law in 1879 fit the powerful the way a good coat fits its owner perfectly everywhere it mattered. She had spent 14 months and nearly everything she owned trying to hold someone responsible. She lost on every count. When it was done, she sold the house in Carbondale, paid what she owed, counted what remained, and made a decision. West. Not because she believed in the promise of it, because there was nowhere else the math worked out. On the riverboat heading up toward the Missouri, she shared a covered deck with a man named Fergus McCrae. He was somewhere past 70, built like a man who had spent his life lifting things with hands so scarred they looked like a map of somewhere difficult. He was a stonemason by trade. He told her, retired, now going to see his son in Omaha before he died, which he seemed to regard as a practical matter rather than a sentimental one. He whittled in the evenings and talked when she was willing to listen. One night, with the river black and wide on both sides and Astrid asleep against Maren's arm, Fergus pulled a folded sheet of newspaper from his coat and spread it on the crate between them. He had drawn on it in pencil cross-sections of Wall's angles of load distribution, the way heat moved through different materials at different thicknesses. He explained without being asked the physics of a wall that survives mass thermal retention, the difference between a structure that resists weather and one that simply endures it. "Thin walls are built by men who trust the weather to be reasonable," he said, tracing a pencil line across the cross-section. "Thick walls are built by people who've already learned it isn't." He died 2 nights later, somewhere between Council Bluffs and Omaha, in his sleep quietly, as if he had finished what he came to say. His son collected the body at the dock. Marin kept the newspaper. By the time she reached Harlan Flats, she had memorized every line on it. The land office in Harlan Flats occupied the front half of a frame building that also served as the postmaster's station, which meant it was always crowded with people who had other reasons to be there. Marin stood in line on a Thursday morning in April 1882. Astrid at her side, Ruth behind her, the folded homestead documents from the territorial office in her coat pocket. The clerk was a man named Peters 50s, a mustache that had more authority than he did. He reviewed her papers with the careful attention of someone looking for a reason to say no. He found one her husband's name appeared in the prior correspondence, and the transfer to a widow's claim required he was almost apologetic about it. A male co-signatory or proof of sole legal competency under the Married Women's Property Act of 1875, which he was not certain applied in Nebraska territory in the same form. It applies. Marin set a folded document on the counter. Section 4, Paragraph 2 extended to territorial jurisdictions by the 1880 federal provision. My husband is deceased. I am the legal holder of record. You have everything you need to process this claim. Peters unfolded the document, read it, looked at her over the top of his glasses. Behind her, a voice. If there's any difficulty, I'd be glad to stand in as co-signatory. Conrad Hale, I think we've met Peters. The voice was well-dressed, if a voice could be. Warm, assured the voice of a man who had never stood in a line that didn't eventually move for him. Marin did not turn around. There's no difficulty. She kept her eyes on Peters until he stamped the form. She learned later from Ruth, who had a gift for collecting information in the time it took other people to buy flour, that the parcel she had chosen, 65 acres of flat, treeless ground on the northern edge of Harlan Flats, sat directly across the route Conrad Hale wanted to use for a new grain storage facility. He had been planning the route for 2 years. He had not yet purchased the land because he was waiting for the right moment to make an offer he considered appropriate, which meant an offer the owner could not afford to refuse. The owner had changed. The new owner had not waited for an offer. She chose the parcel for the low rise at its center. Barely a rise, really more of a hesitation in the flatness, maybe 3 feet above the surrounding grade. Most settlers looking at that parcel would have seen the rise as a liability, harder to plow around, easier to puddle water along its base. Marin saw a natural windbreak. She saw an elevated foundation that would drain properly. She walked the perimeter 4 times over 2 days, measuring angles of exposure with a compass and a stick before she drove her first stake. She began cutting sod that same week. A breaking plow borrowed from a neighbor 2 miles east opened the first strips, and then she went to work by hand, sizing the bricks the way Fergus McRae's drawing specified: 60 centimeters long, 30 wide, 10 thick, each one close to 50 pounds when damp. She stacked them in courses the way a mason lays stone. Each course offset from the one below it, no 2 vertical joints aligned. The walls climbed slowly, 90 centimeters thick at the base. She had seen the soddy cabins other homesteaders had built, 12-18 inches of wall, quick to raise quick, to leak quick, to surrender to a hard wind. They were built by people who intended to survive one winter at a time. She was building for a different calculation. The first attempt at the northwest corner failed in early June, when she discovered she had not accounted correctly for the cumulative lateral load on the long wall. The corner bowed, then cracked, then had to come down. She stood looking at the rubble for a few minutes, then began pulling the bricks apart to restack the good ones separately from the damaged ones. Ruth mixed mortar clay, dried grass water with the systematic focus of someone who understood that the quality of the mixture was not secondary to the work, but was the work. Astrid carried water from the cistern they had dug first before anything else, because Marin had learned that you built the water source before you built the walls. The girl asked questions constantly, the relentless interrogation of a 7-year-old encountering something she could not yet categorize. Why do we need the walls so thick? Because thin walls let the cold in. Mrs. Hennessy's walls aren't thick and she doesn't get cold. Mrs. Hennessy hasn't been through a real winter here yet. What's a real winter? Marin said a brick. You'll know it when it comes. The town watched. In the particular way of small, isolated communities watching was its own form of commentary. Women who came to the water pump on the east side of town could see the barrow's walls rising over the flat, slowly week by week, reaching a height that no soddy in the territory had reached before. The men at Hale's store on Saturday afternoons developed a running assessment of Marin's progress, that was equal parts entertainment and judgment. Conrad Hale was not a cruel man in the way that required raised voices. He was something more effective, a man with social authority and a gift for the phrase that lands and sticks. One Saturday, he stood at the store counter and described at modest volume, but within clear hearing of 8 other men, a woman constructing her own burial mound on the north end of town. He called it the barrow, an old word for a grave mound, and explained for those who didn't know that the ancient practice involved burying the dead under a great pile of earth so they could be found again by people who came later. He found this apparently very apt. The name spread through Harlan Flats the way a match moves across dry grass. By October of 1882, there was not a person in town who called it anything else. The mayor, a compact, careful man named Silas Drummond, who owed his position largely to Hale's endorsement, made a remark at a town council meeting about the somewhat alarming aesthetics of the construction, which he called inconsistent with the civic aspirations of a growing community. He did not name Marin. He didn't need to. Myron heard all of this. Ruth made sure of that, not out of cruelty, but out of the conviction that a person should know the terrain they were moving through. Marin's response each time was to set another brick. She finished the main hall in the autumn of 1884, 2 years after she drove the first stake. What stood was not beautiful by any measure Harlan Flats applied to buildings. It was long, low, and massive, its sod walls 2 feet thick at the base, its roof a layered cap of sod over cottonwood beams, so heavy it would have taken 6 men to lift a single one. 2 fieldstone fireplaces anchored each end, built from rock she had hauled in a wagon from a glacial deposit 5 miles east, fitted without mortar gaps, using a technique she had worked out by building and dismantling a test section 3 times before she got it right. The floor was packed earth beaten to the hardness of cured leather. The stable wing to the north housed her horse Slate and 2 milk cows, their body heat drawn through a shared wall into the main living area by a design she had thought out herself during a winter night in their first year, when she lay in the cold watching her breath rise and thought about where warmth went when it left a body. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was the one they called the Great Die-Up, though the name came later after people had enough distance to name it rather than just survive it. In January and February, temperatures in Nebraska Territory dropped to 40 below zero and held there for weeks at a time. The range cattle died in their hundreds of thousands, frozen where they stood. Homesteaders who had thought their frame houses adequate discovered that adequate was a peacetime word. Marin opened the barrow's doors on the 7th of January when the temperature had held at 35 below for 4 consecutive days, and the Weber family's youngest child had come down with something the cold was not helping. She did not make an announcement. She simply opened the door and let it be known through Ruth, who knew everyone, that there was room inside. 12 people came the first night, more the second. At its peak that winter, she housed 19 people in the barrow for 11 consecutive days. Conrad Hale arrived on the 3rd night. He came alone, his coat buttoned to the throat, carrying nothing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a man accustomed to entering rooms on his own terms, reassessing the terms, then stepped inside. The main hall smelled of wood smoke, dried grass, damp wool. 19 people looked at him with varying degrees of interest. He did not look at Marin. She was at the far end, checking the mortar around the south fireplace with a small pick, her back to the room. She heard the door. She didn't turn. He found a place against the east wall and sat. He was still there in the morning. He left the following afternoon when the temperature climbed enough to make the walk back to his house survivable. He did not speak to Marin before leaving. Ruth watched him go. Not even a nod. He doesn't owe me a nod. He owes you considerably more than that. Marin set down her pick. What someone owes and what they pay are different ledgers. I stopped keeping the first one years ago. Spring came the way it always did on the plains, suddenly without apology. The cattle losses were tallied. The stories of survival and the stories of who had not survived were exchanged at the store, at the church, at the post office. The barrow was mentioned in these conversations, usually with a note of grudging acknowledgement that softened quickly back into the familiar distance the town kept from Marin Solvik. What no one in Harlan Flats knew, because Hale had been careful, because Lincoln was far away, because legal proceedings moved at the pace of a man in no hurry, was that he had filed a challenge to Marin's land claim in the spring of 1884, on the grounds that a woman without a male household head could not be considered to be meaningfully developing the parcel under the productive use requirements of the homestead statutes. The challenge had moved slowly through the territorial court system, been delayed twice by calendar conflicts, been reviewed by two different clerks who had different opinions about the applicable statute, and was, as of January 1888, still technically pending in the records office in Lincoln. Ruth had found out about it through the wife of a clerk who had mentioned it to the wife of a merchant who had mentioned it to Ruth during a quilting afternoon in November 1887. Ruth had told Marin that same evening, sitting at the south fireplace after supper. Marin sat with this information for a long time before she spoke. "How far along is it?" "Still in preliminary review, far as I can tell. Hasn't been assigned a hearing date." Marin looked at the fire. "Then it can wait." "It can't wait forever." "No, but I have other things to build first." What she had built that autumn, in addition to reinforcing the north wall's foundation against the heaving the 1887 frost had produced, was a second root cellar extension dug out and lined with fieldstone over 6 weeks in September and October, stocked with enough salt pork, dried corn beans, potatoes, and preserved fruit to feed a dozen people through 3 months without a trip to the store. She had also, for reasons she did not articulate to Ruth, purchased an additional 60 meters of braided hemp rope, which she coiled and hung from a peg inside the stable door. Ruth had looked at the rope when Marin hung it up. Planning something. Planning for what happens when planning fails. She had also, in July of 1887, watched her daughter Astrid pack a canvas bag and climb into the seat of the Miller family's eastbound wagon. The girl was 12 years old, dark-haired like Eric had been with Marin's jaw, and her father's way of needing a room to feel possible. She had spent the summer explaining with the roundabout honesty of someone who loves the person they are hurting, that Harlan Flats felt like a place where nothing could start, that her friends' families looked at their house with expressions Astrid had stopped being able to ignore, that there was a school in Omaha where her cousin attended and where no one knew anything about the barrow or the woman who built it. Marin listened to all of this at the kitchen table over 3 separate evenings. On the 4th evening, she packed Astrid a box of food enough for the journey and enough money from the tin in the root cellar to cover 3 months' board while Astrid found her feet. She walked her daughter to the miller's wagon at 6 in the morning, hugged her once hard, and stepped back. She stood in the road until the wagon was gone from sight. Then she walked back to the barrow, went inside, and did not come out until supper. Ruth did not ask. That night, after the fire had burned low and the house was quiet, Ruth lay in her bunk and listened. From behind the door of Marin's room came a sound she could not quite identify, rhythmic, low, like someone moving something very heavy across a floor. In the morning, Ruth looked at the room. Nothing had moved. She never asked about the sound. Some things she understood were not about being answered. On the night of January 11th, 1888, Marin sat at the table after Ruth had gone to sleep and wrote 3 lines in the small leather notebook she kept for practical records. Weather observations, supply inventories, notes on the structural behavior of the walls in extreme cold. Then she tore out a separate sheet, wrote something longer on it, folded it, and addressed it to Astrid in Omaha. She did not put it with the letters to be posted. She left it on the table folded where it sat through the night. In the morning before Ruth was awake, Marin was already outside looking northwest, watching the horizon begin to change color in a way that had no name she knew of, but that she recognized with the full weight of everything she had spent 6 years building against. The line on the horizon was thin. It would not stay thin. She went back inside. By 9 in the morning, the thermometer outside Hale's store had climbed to 11 degrees, and the mood in Harlan Flats had shifted into something that resembled celebration. 3 women on the main street had stopped their errands to stand in the thin January sun with their faces tilted upward, eyes closed as if receiving something they had been owed for months. Mayor Drummond's youngest, August, had already lost his coat somewhere between the house and the schoolhouse, and no one had chased after him with it. The cold that had pressed down on the Nebraska territory for the better part of 3 weeks had apparently relented. People were willing to believe that. Marin was at the grain shed behind Conrad Hale's operation before 7:30. She had saddled Slate in the dark, the horse's breath coming in long white columns in the not yet warmed air of the stable. The line on the northwest horizon had thickened since 5 o'clock, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it, but enough that the shape of what was coming had become legible to her in the way a word becomes legible once you've learned the alphabet. She rode the half-mile into town at a pace that was deliberate without being hurried, because hurrying would have been wasteful, because she had learned that the time between recognizing a danger and being consumed by it was exactly as long as you used it well. 6 men were unloading a supply wagon at Hale's grain shed when she arrived. They worked with the relaxed efficiency of men who believed they had a full day ahead of them. Hale himself stood on the loading dock with a ledger checking quantities against a manifest, his coat open at the collar because it was warm enough for that. Marin stopped Slate 10 feet from the dock. You need to get those men inside, all of them, within the hour. Hale looked up from his ledger. His expression went through a brief internal sequence. Recognition calibration, the particular quality of patience a man adopts when he intends to be dismissive without appearing to lose his temper. Mrs. Solvik, you've come early. There's weather coming from the northwest, the kind that doesn't give warning once it arrives. Your shed's west wall won't hold against what's behind that horizon. He looked northwest. The sky was blue, the line thin, the morning objectively beautiful. He looked back at her with something that might have been in a different man, genuine curiosity, but in him was the studied performance of it. I appreciate the concern. I'll note that the weather office in Lincoln hasn't issued any advisory. The weather office in Lincoln is looking at yesterday's data. His mouth tightened briefly at one corner, the only version of annoyance he allowed himself in public. Mrs. Solvik, I suspect you've spent sufficient time inside your particular structure that perhaps the open sky has started to look threatening by comparison. I have a manifest to complete. He turned back to his ledger. The men on the dock had stopped working to watch with the quiet interest of people who are not in the argument but are close enough to be affected by it. Marin held her position for 3 seconds, looking at the 6 men on the dock. They were not her employees. They were not her concern in any way that Harlan Flats would have recognized. She looked at them the way she had once looked at the northwest corner of the Barrow's first attempt, with the clear assessment of something that was going to fail before anyone responsible was willing to admit it. She turned Slate toward the schoolhouse without another word. Miss Theodora Vance was writing the day's arithmetic problems on the board when Marin knocked at the schoolhouse door at 10 minutes past 8. 28 children arranged in 4 rows looked up. Teddy Vance, small, precise, with dark eyes that processed information at a speed her composed expression never quite revealed, crossed the room to the door without being hurried. Marin spoke at a volume the children couldn't hear over their own ambient noise. She had perhaps 5 minutes of explanation laid out without embellishment. The horizon, the rate of change, the structure of what was coming, based on a pressure behavior she had observed twice in the previous 6 years, and that had, on both occasions, produced the worst conditions of those respective winters. She did not tell Teddy Vance to do anything. She laid the information down the way she laid sod bricks one flat surface against another, letting the weight speak. Teddy Vance's face did not change during this. When Marin finished, she asked one question. How long do we have? If the rate of approach holds somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, maybe less. When it comes, it will come fast. Yes. Teddy looked back into the classroom. 28 children between the ages of 6 and 14 seated in a frame building with walls 8 centimeters thick, 3 miles from the nearest structure capable of holding heat in a serious storm. She was 24 years old. She had been teaching in Harlan Flats for 2 years. She looked back at Marin with the expression of someone doing the arithmetic quickly and not enjoying the result. I'll keep them together, Teddy said. Whatever happens. Marin nodded once, turned Slate back toward home. She spent the next 3 hours in motion. The root cellar extension she had dug in the fall was already stocked, but she moved additional firewood from the outer pile to the stack inside the stable door, where it would stay dry regardless of what the sky produced. Ruth had both stoves burning by the time Marin returned from town, the main hall warming past comfortable toward the sustained heat that thick walls could hold for hours after a fire was reduced to coals. Marin pulled every blanket in the house from its storage place, sorted them by size, stacked them on the bench nearest the south fireplace. She checked the rope on the stable peg, 60 meters of braided hemp, still coiled, still sound. Ruth watched her take the rope down. What's that for? In case I need to move people through zero visibility. Ruth stood with a pot of water she had just filled from the indoor cistern, looking at her sister across the main hall. There were things Ruth Solvik understood without being told, mostly because she had spent 28 years watching a woman who did not explain herself unless the explanation served a purpose. How many people? I don't know yet. How many can the building hold? Marin's hands moved over the rope, checking for phrase. More than the town thinks. At 2 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the temperature outside was still 8 degrees, and the children in Miss Vance's schoolhouse were finishing their midday meal. August Drummond had found his coat by then. One of the older girls had retrieved it from the fence post where he'd left it and made him put it on, which he had accepted with the resigned dignity of a 6-year-old overruled by consensus. At 2:07, the west window exploded inward. Not broke, not cracked. Exploded, the frame punching into the room on a wall of air that arrived so fast, several children were knocked sideways in their seats before the sound of breaking glass had finished. The temperature inside the schoolhouse dropped 3 degrees in the time it took Teddy Vance to get from her desk to the center of the room. Outside, the sky was no longer blue. The blue had been consumed entirely between 1 minute and the next by a gray-white mass that moved like a horizontal avalanche touching the ground, swallowing the town's buildings one by one from west to east as it came. The wind went from a breeze to 95 kilometers per hour in less time than it takes to describe it. The snow it carried was not falling snow, it was ground snow picked up and driven at a horizontal angle with the force of grit in a sandblast. Visibility outside the schoolhouse windows dropped to nothing in under a minute. Teddy Vance's voice cut through the noise of 28 frightened children with the precision of something honed. Everyone to the center of the room. Sit down. Right now. Not a shout of command, which is a different instrument entirely. The children moved. She counted them by touch as they settled, one hand on each shoulder, as she moved through the cluster because she could no longer trust her eyes at the edges of the dim room. The stove was burning, but the heat was already losing the argument. She could feel the temperature dropping in the way a room changes when something large has decided to move through it. The schoolhouse walls flexed. A sound like a low, continuous pressure came through the boards. Not a crack, not a groan, but the acoustic signature of a structure being tested on every surface simultaneously. A second window, the small north-facing one, spiderwebbed from corner to corner. Marin came through the front door at 8 minutes past 2. She had ridden Slate at a full run from the barrow the moment she saw the front wall of the storm hit the edge of the tree line north of town. She had the rope across her saddle, her heaviest coat, 2 pairs of leather work gloves. The cold hit her face when she cleared the windbreak of the north rise like a blade. Not a blade you feel and then adjust to, but one whose temperature is constant no matter how long you stand in it. She dismounted at the schoolhouse door, looped Slate's reins around her arm, pushed inside. What she assessed in the first 4 seconds: the west window, gone north window, compromised stove, losing ground, 28 children between 6 and 14 years old, 1 adult, 8 centimeters of wall between them, and a storm that would reduce that room to open air within an hour. What she calculated in the following 8 seconds: 60 meters of rope, 4 groups of 7, the distance from the schoolhouse to the barrow's north door, the fact that she could not see 20 feet through what was outside. Teddy Vance met her eyes across the cluster of children. "Tell me you have a way." "I have a way. It's going to be hard." "Harder than staying here." Marin looked at the flexing west wall. "No." The plan she described was not complicated, but it required precision. 4 groups, 7 children, each oldest paired with youngest within each group. The groups connected by short bridging lengths cut from the main coil. Each child holding the rope with both hands, no exceptions. Slate would lead at the front with Marin. Teddy would anchor the rear. No one would stop moving for any reason short of a child going down. If a child went down, the nearest older child would pull them up. If that failed, Marin would come back down the line. She was cutting the rope into sections as she explained this, her knife moving with the efficiency of someone for whom tools are extensions of thought rather than separate instruments. She did not look up while she talked. Teddy Vance moved through the children as Marin spoke, sorting them by age, identifying the steady ones, placing the youngest between the reliable older ones with the quiet authority of a woman who had been reading rooms full of children for 2 years. A boy of 13, Will Garrett, got the front position behind Slate. A girl of 12 anchored the rear of the first group. The groupings took 4 minutes. Marin knotted the bridging lines with the specific knots that would hold under load but release under sustained upward pressure in case a child needed to be lifted free. She tied the main line's forward end around her own waist, fed it back through Will's grip, through the first group's bridging, through the second, the third, the rear end around Teddy's waist. She looked at Teddy. "When I move, you move. If you can't hear me, feel the rope. If the rope goes slack, stop. If it pulls, follow." Teddy's face held the expression of someone who has committed to a decision already made and is past the point where second thoughts are useful. "We're ready." Marin opened the door. The first 200 meters were the worst because there was nothing between the schoolhouse and the open ground to the north. No structure, no rise, nothing to reduce the unbroken force of a wind moving at highway speed across flat land. The cold struck the first row of children so fast that the two youngest 6-year-old August Drummond on one side, a girl named Clara Hennessy on the other, both inhaled sharply and then couldn't exhale for a moment, their bodies seizing against the thermal shock. Marin felt this through the rope, a lurch, a stagger, a brief arrest of forward motion. She did not stop. She slowed just enough to let the line restabilize, then pulled the pace forward again. Slate did not need guidance and direction. The horse moved with his head down and his ears flat into the wind, trusting the weight and direction of Marin's hand on the lead line, the way he had trusted it for 6 years across every variety of difficult ground this territory produced. He was not unafraid. His breathing was fast, his muscles hard under her hand, but he was the particular kind of afraid that doesn't stop moving, which is the only kind of fear that matters in a storm. At the 100-meter mark by Marin's count of paces, 3 children in the third group went down simultaneously when a gust hit the left side of the line at an angle that had nothing to do with the prevailing wind, a pressure eddy off the collapsed barn they were passing on the west. The rope snapped taut, pulled the third group's anchor girl sideways, dragged the 12-year-old to her knees. Teddy Vance at the rear felt the whole system jerk left through the rope at her waist. She drove both feet into the ground, turned her body sideways against the pull, held the rear position steady while 3 smaller children were hauled upright by their group's anchor. 30 seconds of stop time, the wind treating that pause as an invitation. Then the line moved again. The second 100 meters brought the partial shelter of a building on the east side, what was left of it. The structure had already lost its north face, and the sound it made in the wind was a low structural moan that the children heard without seeing the source, which was in some ways worse than seeing it. Marin kept the pace. She had learned in the first winter she spent in a serious Nebraska storm that the mind in extreme cold will begin to negotiate with itself, will begin to offer reasons why stopping is acceptable, why a pause is reasonable, why the next step can wait. The only answer to this is to already be in motion, because motion continued is easier than motion restarted. At the 200-meter point, Slate stopped. He stopped with all 4 feet planted head up despite the wind nostrils working. Marin did not pull the lead. She put her left hand flat on the side of his neck, just below the jaw, and counted to 20 in her head, applying no pressure, no correction, just the steady warmth of her palm against his skin. The horse's breathing slowed from rapid to merely fast. She felt the moment his weight shifted from lock to ready. She began to walk. Slate walked with her. She would think about that moment later in the warmth of the barrow and understand that Slate had smelled something in the wind that she hadn't been able to process through all the other inputs of the storm. Probably the direction shift that had been coming for several minutes, the wind's angle changing as the front's leading edge fully passed overhead. The horse had needed 20 seconds to reclassify it from unknown to navigable. She had given him those seconds without demanding anything. He had given her the rest of the journey in return. The third 100 meters were the coldest because the temperature was still dropping as the full mass of Arctic air settled in, and the children had now been in it long enough that the cold was no longer an external event, but a bodily condition. Marin heard through the wind sounds. She categorized quickly a child crying in one of the middle groups that was actually acceptable crying required consciousness. A silence from the rear of the third group that was not acceptable. She turned, moved back along the line, hand over hand, found a boy of 7 who had gone beyond shivering into the still absent stage that she recognized. She put her face close to his eyes tracked. She took his hands off the rope, folded them inside her coat against her chest for 45 seconds, then replaced them. He gripped. She moved back to the front. At the 300-meter point, August Drummond's legs stopped working. It was not a dramatic collapse. He simply stopped being able to coordinate them the way a machine stops when the mechanism governing a particular function gives out. His grip on the rope held, which meant he hung from it, rather than falling the rope around his section, going briefly taut in a sideways direction. The girl ahead of him in the group 13 felt the pull and turned into the wind to face it, holding his connection steady with both hands, planted a teenager serving as anchor for a 6-year-old who had run out of available resources. Marin handed Slate's lead line to Will Garrett at the front. She said one thing into the boy's ear before she left his position. Straight north. Don't turn. Don't stop. Then she moved back down the line to August Ben, lifted him onto her left shoulder, his body weight settling across the back of her neck. She could not feel the weight in her hands by this point. She could feel it in her spine and the compression of her hip joints as she straightened. She moved back to the front, took Slate's line from Will, resumed the pace. The last 200 meters she navigated with her eyes closed. There was nothing to see. The snow was not falling from any direction that corresponded to the sky. It was simply everywhere. Every particle of it moving at the same speed as the wind, which meant the air itself had become a solid thing of sorts, white-gray, total with no depth of field. She closed her eyes because they were providing no useful data, only distraction. She felt the wind against the left side of her face, slightly behind the cheekbone, which meant she was holding the correct heading. She felt the ground slope upward under her feet by 2 degrees, the rise at the north end of her parcel. The same barely perceptible elevation that had convinced her 6 years ago that this was where the building should stand. She counted paces. At 63, she opened her eyes. The door of the barrow was 4 feet in front of her. Ruth had hung a lantern beside it. The light reached maybe 3 feet into the storm before the white swallowed it, but from 3 feet away, it was sufficient. Marin pressed forward. Those last feet hit the door with her shoulder, pushed through into the heat of the main hall, and felt the wind seal itself out behind her as the door swung shut. The main hall was warm, impossibly offensively warm compared to what existed on the other side of the door, a warmth that hit the children coming through like a physical correction, like being pulled back from an edge. Ruth had both stoves at full burn. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried grass, the mineral sharpness of the fieldstone fireplace. Ruth moved through the children as they came in blankets, open hands, checking faces, moving the ones who were dangerously still to the closest heat source first. Teddy Vance came through last. She stood just inside the door, the rope still knotted at her waist, her face gray-white except for 2 patches of red across the cheekbones. She looked at the children arranged around the fireplaces, counted them silently. 28. Then she looked at Marin, who had set August Drummond down on the bench closest to the south stove. The boy's eyes were open. Color was already beginning to return to his face in the warmth. He looked at Marin with the unguarded solemnity of a 6-year-old who has understood at some level below language that something significant has just happened to him. Marin looked at him for a moment. Then she straightened, walked to the south stove, poured herself half a mug of coffee from the pot Ruth kept on the iron top. She drank it, standing looking at the room. Children wrapped in blankets, Ruth moving between them. Teddy Vance cutting the rope sections from children's wrists with the knife Marin had left on the table for that purpose. The wind outside hit the barrow's west wall at the same moment. 90-centimeter sod absorbed it the way a hillside absorbs water completely, without complaint, without so much as a tremor in the beams overhead. Inside, the lanterns did not flicker. The children one by one stopped shaking. Ruth appeared at Marin's shoulder, her voice low enough that only her sister could hear it. "You're not going back out." Marin set down the mug. She looked at the extra coat hanging by the stable door, the one she kept for exactly the conditions that existed on the other side of the wall. The Sorensens are in a frame house half a mile south. Elias Pruitt's shop faces due west. 6 men were still working Hale's grain shed when I rode through at 8 this morning. Ruth's jaw set. She recognized this particular configuration of her sister's face, not determination, which would have been warmer, but the colder thing beneath it, the one that had nothing to do with wanting to go out, and everything to do with having already decided. "The rope," Marin said. "I need you to anchor one end at the north post. Tie it high enough to follow through the drifts." She was already moving toward the stable door for the extra coat. "I'll be back before dark." Ruth stood in the center of the main hall, 28 children behind her in various stages of recovery, the storm hammering at the walls with the indifferent force of something that does not know it is being endured. She looked at her sister pulling on the second coat over the first. "You built those walls thick enough to hold us." Ruth's voice held something past worry, something that recognized the shape of the thing it couldn't stop. "You didn't build them thick enough to hold you back." Marin pulled on the outer gloves, checked the knot on the rope section she'd kept for the return guideline. She looked at Ruth across the warm room, the fire behind her sister, throwing long shadows toward the door. Keep the south stove at full. Don't let August sleep until his color is back. She turned to the door. Count everyone twice an hour. She opened the door. The storm came in for the 3 seconds it took her to step through. Then the door closed behind her, the latch caught the cold, sealed out, the warmth sealed in. On the bench by the south stove, August Drummond pulled his blanket tighter and watched the door. She made 4 trips before dark. The rope Ruth anchored to the north post gave her a line through the worst of it, 30 meters of guide she could follow by feel in both directions. Hand over hand, the braided hemp, the only fixed object in a world that had lost all other fixed qualities. Beyond the rope's end, she moved by the same method she had used on the final stretch with the children. Wind angle on her face. Pace count the slope of the ground under her boots, telling her things her eyes could no longer confirm. The Sorensen house was the first stop. She found it by the sound the damaged wall made a rhythmic flexing, a wooden lung breathing in and out under pressure before she found it by sight. The west wall had separated from the north corner, not collapsed, but opened like a book being bent backward, a gap at the top growing with each gust. Inside, Jacob Sorensen had his back against that wall, not hiding behind it, bracing it. His body weight against the board's arms, spread palms flat, as if he could persuade 200 kilograms of wind to reconsider. His wife Britta had the 3 children in the southeast corner with every piece of fabric in the house layered over them. The temperature inside was already below freezing. Maren told Jacob to move. He looked at the wall. She told him the wall was already decided, that the question now was only whether his family walked out of it or was carried. He looked at his wife, who was already on her feet pulling children upright before Maren had finished the sentence. He went to the floor grate first, pulled up a small iron box from below the boards. Deed certificates, the paper record of everything he owned. His hands shook badly enough that he dropped it twice before getting it under his arm. Maren held the door against the wind's pressure while he secured it, then led them out in a line with the rope through their hands, Jacob at the back, Britta in the middle, children between them in order of size. The second trip brought the Webb family a mother, her teenage son, her elderly father, who moved with the specific, careful determination of a man who has decided he will not be carried by anyone regardless of circumstances. He made it on his own feet. Just. The third trip was the grain shed. The western wall had come down completely, the corrugated sections peeled back at their bolted seams by a wind that had simply declined to acknowledge their existence. What remained was 3 walls and a floor, and the particular cold of a large open space, with no barrier on its windward side, a cold that was somehow worse than being outside, because it combined the full force of the moving air with the additional chill of the concrete floor beneath it. Maren found the 6 workers first clustered around a lantern that had long since gone out, huddled into one mass of bodies for heat conservation in the way animals do when no other option remains. She moved them toward the gap in the west wall, back out into the storm, one hand on each shoulder as they filed past. Conrad Hale was in the northeast corner. He sat on an overturned crate with his back against the last standing wall, still in the clothing he had worn that morning. Coat, vest, all of it correct, as if the propriety of his appearance could hold some line that the physical structure had already surrendered. His ledger was on his knees. He was not reading it. He was simply holding it the way a man holds something familiar when the unfamiliar has become total. He looked at her when she crossed the floor toward him. She watched him look at her face, at her coat, at the rope coiled over her shoulder. She watched him understand in sequence what her presence meant, that she had come here deliberately, that she had come through the storm to find this specific place, that she had already moved his workers out before coming to him, that she had done this after he had turned his back on her warning 7 hours earlier. She held out her hand, palm up. The hand itself was a document split at 2 knuckles from the cold purple across the back, calloused from a decade of work that had included building the only structure in Harlan Flats currently capable of holding heat. He looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through his face that had no name in the vocabulary he normally used. He did not take her hand. He stood up, tucking the ledger under his arm, and walked past her toward the gap in the west wall. She followed him out. She did not interpret his refusal of her hand as pride exactly, though pride was part of it. It was something more precise. A man who understood in that moment that accepting help from a hand was different from following the person the hand belonged to, that he could choose one without the formal surrender of the other. It was a small distinction. She let him have it. The storm made no distinction of any kind. The fourth trip brought Elias Pruitt, the blacksmith 70 years old, found in the roofless ruin of his shop, with both hands frozen to the iron of his anvil. Not gripping it, fused to it, the moisture of his palms bonded to the metal in the way wet skin bonds to frozen iron. He had apparently decided at some point in the previous hours that if he could not move to somewhere safe, then the safest place was the thing in his shop that was too heavy to be moved by anything the storm could apply. This was not irrational. It had kept him alive. It had also left him attached to 200 kilograms of iron in the open air at 38 below zero. Myron worked each finger individually, cupping her hands around each one, pressing her palms against the metal to transfer the heat of her body into the contact surface until the seal released. She did this for 8 minutes in a position that required her to kneel on the concrete floor of the roofless shop, with the wind taking everything not anchored to the earth. Elias Pruitt said nothing during this process. He watched her hands with the focused attention of a craftsman observing technique he respects. When his hands were free, he stood, worked his fingers open-closed twice, then walked to her left side and waited for her to lead. On the way back, he matched her pace without being asked. By the time she brought Elias Pruitt through the north door, the main hall held 71 people, and the geometry of this was not comfortable. 28 children occupied most of the floor space closest to the two stoves, arranged in the overlapping pattern Ruth had organized, with the systematic efficiency of someone managing a resource allocation problem rather than a crisis. Adults filled the remaining floor, the benches, the stable passage. 12 people were in the stable itself alongside Slate and the two cows, the horses various arrivals had brought with them, the body heat of the animals providing a secondary warmth that made the stable wings several degrees above what its size alone would have managed. The walls did not flex, the roof did not shed. The sound of the storm outside was present, audible as a low-frequency pressure, a suggestion of the violence occurring on the other side of 90 centimeters of packed earth. But it was the sound of something being kept out rather than something breaking through. The lanterns burned without flickering. The stove fires maintained their rhythm. The barrow held 71 people in the same way it had held the cold back for 6 years, without announcement, without visible effort, by the simple material fact of what it was built to do. Marin sat on the floor near the south stove with her back against the wall, her boots off her feet wrapped in a dry blanket Ruth had produced from somewhere. She had stopped shaking, which she chose to interpret as recovery. She drank what Ruth put in her hands, hot broth, heavily salted, the kind that restores before it tastes good, and looked at the room. Teddy Vance had organized the children into sleep shifts, the younger ones already unconscious in their blanket layers, the older ones kept softly awake in rotation. So there was always someone conscious to watch for the signs of cold injury she had briefed them on. The teacher's classroom economy applied to survival logistics worked with the same precision in both contexts. Hale sat against the east wall. He had not spoken to anyone since he came through the door. He was not looking at the ledger anymore. It sat on the floor beside him, closed. He was looking at the ceiling, the cottonwood beams, the sod overhead, the structure that was currently performing the function he had spent 6 years dismissing as unnecessary. Whatever calculation he was running, he ran it silently with the focused inward expression of a man revising a set of accounts that came out to a very different number than expected. The storm ran for 18 hours. It stopped on the morning of January 13th, the way it had arrived, without negotiation, without gradual retreat. Just a cessation, a sudden absence of the pressure that had been omnipresent for so long that the silence it left felt structural, as if the walls had been holding the noise as well as the cold. People emerged slowly. The temperature outside was still 38 below zero. The cold had not relented, only the violence. Exposed skin went white in under a minute. The air was clear and vicious, the sky a blue so sharp it seemed to have edges. Harlan Flats had been taken apart. The schoolhouse was a geometry problem with a wrong answer. The frame collapsed inward from the northwest corner. The roof dropped, the stove visible through what had been the south wall, half buried in wreckage. The west windows of Hale's main store building were gone, the interior exposed to a night at 38 below, the goods inside, frozen solid or scattered. Mayor Drummond's house stood on 3 walls with its roof displaced 40 feet to the east, sitting on the surface of a snowfield, like an object set down by something enormous, with no particular concern for placement. 6 other structures in Harlan Flats had sustained damage that ranged from major to total. The barrow had no visible damage. Not a crack in the wall surface, not a shifted beam overhead, not a single place where the storm had found purchase. It stood on the rise at the north end of the parcel with the same squared, undemonstrative solidity it had always presented, looking if anything slightly more permanent by comparison with what surrounded it. People stood in the brutal cold looking south at the town, then turning north to look at the barrow, making this comparison with their eyes for a long time before anyone tried to make it with words. They gathered 3 days later when the temperature had climbed enough to allow movement without immediate injury. The meeting took place inside the barrow, not because it was convenient, but because it was the only structure in Harlan Flats intact enough to hold the number of people who needed to be present. Marin had not called the meeting. Mayor Drummond had, which itself represented a data point about how the previous 72 hours had reorganized certain assumptions. Hyle stood up before the mayor had finished his opening remarks. The room adjusted its attention. Conrad Hale standing up in a meeting was not unusual. He had been standing up in meetings in Harlan Flats for 15 years, usually to considerable effect. What was unusual was the quality of stillness that preceded it. He stood with the ledger he had carried through the storm still in his left hand, though he did not open it. He looked at the room rather than at any one person in it, the way a man looks at something he's been wrong about for long enough that the wrongness has become structural. I have a legal matter to address before anything else. His voice had its habitual authority, the instrument in working order, even when the man holding it was not. In the spring of 1884, I filed a challenge to Mrs. Solvik's land claim with the territorial court in Lincoln. The challenge was based on her status as a woman without a male household head, which I argued made her unable to satisfy the productive use requirement of the Homestead Statute. A pause. I withdrew that challenge on the morning of January 13th, before I came to this meeting. The sound in the room was not quite silence. It was the noise of 71 people processing information that reorganized something. I filed it because I wanted this land for a grain route. I sustained it because I was confident I would eventually win it. I was not wrong about the law as it stood in 1884. I was wrong about what mattered. He looked at the ledger in his hand, then set it on the bench beside him. Mrs. Solvik came to my grain shed on the morning of January 12th. She told me to bring my workers inside. She explained what was coming. I told her she had been in her soddy too long and turned back to my manifest. The muscle in his jaw moved once. 6 men who worked for me were inside that shed when the west wall came down. She went back for them, in the storm, after I had dismissed her. He stopped. When he continued, his voice had dropped to the register that requires rooms to be quiet to hear it. She pulled my workers out one by one. Then she came to the corner where I was sitting and held out her hand. He turned to look at Marin directly for the first time since the storm. I didn't take it. I'd like to say that was the lowest thing I did in connection with this woman, but it wasn't even the worst thing I did that afternoon, let alone across 6 years. He picked up the ledger not to open it, but to have something in his hands. I have no claim on her forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I'm standing up in this room to say publicly what I did and what she did, because this community made itself a party to the first part of it, whether it knew it or not, every time it laughed at the name I gave this building. Every time it let my judgment substitute for its own. He sat down. Mayor Drummond, who had been sitting with his hands clasped and his eyes on the floor, stood up. His voice broke on the first word, which he cleared away before continuing. He talked about August. He talked about what it had meant to walk out of the barrow on the morning of the 13th to find his house's roof sitting on the snow 40 feet from where it belonged, knowing that his son was warm inside the building he had called aesthetically unseemly in a public meeting in 1883. He did not try to be eloquent about it. Eloquence under those conditions would have been an insult to the subject. Teddy Vance spoke next. She stood with the particular straightness of someone who has been frightened past the point of pretending otherwise. She talked about the schoolhouse walls flexing. She talked about counting 28 children by touch in the dim room after the window went. She said, I had hymns, I had hope. Mrs. Solvik had rope a method a horse that trusted her walls, that could hold what she brought to them, because she had built those walls to be ready before anyone told her they needed to be ready. That is not luck. That is a different way of accounting for time. Others spoke. Marin sat in the chair Ruth had placed near the south stove, listening with the unchanged attention she brought to everything, Total evaluative without performance. Then someone knocked on the north door. Ruth was closest. She opened it. The cold came in with the brief violence it always did when the door opened, then was sealed out. Ruth stood in the doorway, looking at the person outside, for 2 seconds not speaking. Then she stepped back to let the visitor through. Astrid Solvik was 13 years old, dark-haired, wearing a coat that had been adequate for Omaha in January, but was not adequate for what she had traveled through to get here. Her face was reddened from cold, her eyes reddened from something else entirely. She had left Omaha when the news of the storm reached the city on the afternoon of the 12th by the first available transport, which had gotten her as far as a relay station 12 miles south from which she had ridden behind a ranch hand, heading north on the morning of the 13th. She had been trying to get here for 36 hours. 71 people watched her stand in the doorway of the house she had left 7 months ago because she was ashamed of it. Maren looked at her daughter across the length of the main hall, across the heads of the people the building had held, across the distance that was not only the floor between them, but the 7 months before it, and the evening Maren had stood in a road watching a wagon until it disappeared, and the sound Ruth had heard through a closed door that night, low and rhythmic, like someone moving something too heavy to be moved. Astrid looked back with an expression that was past the point where expressions have categories. It was just her face open the way faces are, when what they carry is too heavy to arrange into something presentable. Maren stood. She walked the length of the hall through the gathered people, moving between them without hurrying. She reached Astrid and put both arms around her, her daughter's cold coat against her chest, her chin coming down to the top of Astrid's head. Neither of them spoke. The room, which had been quiet, became quieter in the way rooms do when they recognize that what is happening in front of them is not for them exactly, but that they are permitted to witness it. Ruth closed the door against the cold. The latch caught, the warmth sealed in. When Maren finally stepped back, Astrid's mouth opened on something apology explanation, the first word of whatever she had prepared to say across 36 hours of difficult travel. Maren shook her head once gently. Whatever it was could wait. Some debts between people are not served by being itemized. The building had held. The girl was here. Maren spoke last. She stood near the south fireplace, turned partially toward the fire, as if the words were as much for herself as for anyone. She spoke without notes, without the formal structures of a prepared statement, in the plain-spoken rhythm of a woman who understood that the truth does not require architecture. She talked about Fergus Mockery, the stonemason who had not lived to see what his one conversation produced, about the tattered newspaper she still kept in the small box under the table, about the 2 times the northwest corner had failed during construction, how the second failure had taught her something. The first failure hadn't, because the second failure had come after she thought she had already learned the lesson. A wall that has never failed, she said, looking at the fire, is a wall that hasn't been tested yet. I know this one holds because I watched 2 versions of it fall first. She looked at the room then, not at Hale, not at the mayor, but at the whole of it. The Sorensens, Elias Pruitt with his bandaged hands, Teddy Vance with the rope section she had kept in her coat pocket since the march. The Webb family, the 6 men from Hale's grain shed, who were alive because she had gone back into the storm for them after it had already taken everything negotiable from her body. Every person who came through that door brought something this building cannot provide on its own. Jakob Sorensen held his wall together long enough for his family to get out. Elias Pruitt made a decision to anchor himself to the one unmovable thing in his shop, which is why he was findable. Teddy Vance stayed in a room with 28 children when she could have left, and because she stayed, they were organized when I arrived. I built the walls. She paused in the way that is not for effect, but for accuracy. The rest of you built the reason they needed to hold. Harlan Flats was rebuilt over the following 2 years. 19 new sod structures rose from the footprints of what had failed, each with walls between 45 and 90 centimeters thick, each with a root cellar dug before the walls went up, each with a rope strung from the north door to the nearest outbuilding, tied to a post at standing height so it could be followed through a drifted yard. Nobody named this practice after Maren, which she would have preferred. Conrad Hale's rebuilt grain shed had 60-centimeter brick walls and a foundation that Maren specified in writing with calculations attached before a single course was laid. He paid her consulting rate without comment. He also, without explaining why to any customer who asked, began stocking 30-meter coils of braided hemp rope at the front counter of his general store. They sold steadily from the first week. Within 2 years, there was not a household in Harlan Flats that did not have one. Teddy Vance taught for 14 more years in the new schoolhouse sod walls, 45 centimeters of storm cellar beneath the northeast corner, accessible through a floor hatch. The rope section she had cut from the guideline on the afternoon of January 12th lived in a glass-fronted box on her desk for all 14 of those years. Children asked about it. She told them the whole story every year in the kind of detail that doesn't simplify for the young, because the young she had found do not need things simplified, they need them told true. August Drummond grew up to study structural engineering in Lincoln. He designed 47 public buildings across Nebraska before he retired every one of them with a storm shelter integrated into the foundation. His standard specification notes attached to each set of drawings in his own handwriting referenced load tolerances, drainage angles, the thermal retention properties of mass walls in extreme cold. At the bottom of each set in smaller letters he wrote, "Built to Solvik Standard." He never explained this to clients who asked. He told them it was a reference to an engineering principle which was not inaccurate. Astrid did not go back to Omaha. She returned to Harlan Flats in the spring, enrolled in Teddy Vance's school, completed her education, trained as a teacher, worked alongside Teddy for 4 years in the same classroom. The thing between her and Marin was not repaired in a single conversation or a formal moment. It was repaired the way walls are repaired, gradually, course by course, each piece placed with attention to what went before it and where the load would fall next. Marin never raised the subject of the departure. Astrid never offered a formal account of it. Ruth stayed. This required no decision. Ruth had never considered leaving, which was its own form of loyalty, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't conceive of an alternative. The barrow stood for 63 years after the blizzard of 1888. It was finally taken down in 1951 when the family who had inherited the parcel decided to build a modern frame house on the rise. The demolition crew worked for 3 days on the walls before getting through them. The sod that Marin Solvik had cut, fitted, compressed, and mortared in 1882, had consolidated over 6 decades into something that behaved more like low-grade concrete than earth-requiring tools the crew had not originally brought for the job. One of the men on the crew told his son afterward that the building had seemed reluctant, that it fought the work the way something fights when it was built to outlast the person trying to take it apart. In 1988, on the 100th anniversary of the schoolhouse blizzard, the grandchildren of the 71 survivors gathered at the north end of the Solvik parcel. They placed a fieldstone marker at the location of the barrow's north door, fitted from local stone mortared properly set level. The inscription on its face read, "Here stood the house that held." On the back, in smaller letters, it was built to fail twice first. The mason who set the stone, when contacted later by a local historian, confirmed only that the second inscription had been specified in the written order he had received. The order was signed with initials A.D. The son of August Drummond, who had handled his father's affairs in the years after the older man's death, confirmed that his father had arranged the marker in the final months of his life, and that the second line had been his father's addition, written in the margin of the original order form, in the careful hand of an engineer who understood that specifications exist to outlast the person who writes them. The fire in the barrow's south stove on the night of January 12, 1888, burned until 4 in the morning before Ruth reduced it to coals. The coals held until dawn without additional fuel. The walls held the heat. 71 people slept inside, some of them, well, some of them badly, but all of them warm. Outside, the Nebraska winter continued to be what it was: not cruel, not kind, but absolute. The walls were equal to it. They had been built by someone who understood that equal was enough.